Hello, everyone. My name's Matthew Harper. I'm one of the admissions tutors at Jesus College in Cambridge. So my role there involves running the process of deciding who gets an offer, although it's as part of a much larger team of people, so it's not just me.
Many people are a bit worried about this year's interview and, of course, interviews in general. Can you tell us what the format of this year's interview will be and what to expect?
Well, obviously, this year's going to be quite a different year to previous years. We've all had to make a lot of changes this year to cope with the pandemic. Now, this year, all of the interviews are going to be online. So they're going to be done in the format that I'm talking to you right now. But exactly what each college decides to do, how they decide to run it, might vary from college to college. You know, which platform they use, how long the interviews might be, and so on. So if you have applied to Cambridge and you're invited to interview, do read those instructions very carefully for your individual college. Don't just rely on what I'm saying. That might be quite a Jesus College specific thing. But broadly speaking, we're trying to replicate what we do in a normal in-person interview and try and make it as similar to that as possible. So normal in-person interviews would involve you as the candidate and two interviewers, two academics who are involved in teaching at the university. This year it might be slightly different. There might be a slightly longer interview with 3 interviewers, for example, at some of the colleges. Again, just read what you're sent very carefully and you'll know what to expect. But beyond the fact that it's on a video screen like this, and that poses some slight differences about how we might interact in, say, some of the science subjects, how we might talk about graphs or data or maths, for example. Apart from that, everything's going to run almost as normal. We're going to be asking about the same kinds of things. We're going to be looking for the same kinds of things. And the way you can prepare for it is broadly the same as you might have prepared for an in-person interview.
Okay. On that note, how would you prepare for an interview, Cambridge interview?
Well, I think it's easier, rather than starting there, is to think, what are we actually trying to achieve here in Cambridge with our interviews? And I think if you can get a sense of what we're trying to achieve and what we're looking for, that can show you maybe what to prepare for, what you can best do to show us those things. So we're looking for, obviously, the best students. But that's very simple to say, but we've got to define what we mean by best. And there's probably 4 things that we're looking for within that. They're people with an excellent academic track record so far. So whatever opportunities they've had, they've taken the most of those opportunities and done really well within the context of their own school background. We're looking for people who have the potential to keep being excellent in that way, all the way through the degree here, and indeed once they've left Cambridge and go on into the world beyond that. So we're looking for potential. We're looking for people who are really enthusiastic and excited about their subject, because these degrees are hard. You've really got to enjoy what you're doing in order to keep going at that for 3 years or more.
Yeah.
And we're looking for people who have got the intellectual or study skills that allow them to do the degree, to get the most out of it, to really use their potential to the greatest possible extent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we'll have seen your academic track record so far in the rest of your application. So we know how you've done at school. We've got your GCSEs or equivalent, ASs if you've done those in various systems. We've got your personal statement. We've got a reference from your school teacher. So we've got a lot of information about that, as well as we've got a lot of information about if there's been any disruption to your schooling in one way or another. So that helps us understand what excellence means in your context. But our interviews are then looking at those other 3 aspects that are a bit harder sometimes to assess just on paper. What's your potential? What's your motivation? And what do you have the right aptitude and skills to be going on and doing it? So when you're preparing for an interview, think about how can you best show us those things. So we're going to, for example, be very interested to know why you want to do this subject, especially if it's a vocational subject like medicine or veterinary medicine. Those are long degrees going towards a job at the end of it. We want to be sure that you understand what that means, what that involves, say, working in our healthcare system, and that this really is what you want to do. That's going to give us more confidence that you are the kind of person who's going to stick with this throughout a really quite hard degree. But in terms of potential and intellectual skills, skills like working independently, skills like seeing problems as a challenge, not as a difficulty, and so on. We're going to be setting you unfamiliar things in the interviews.
Mhm.
In an art subject, it might be something to read, a source or a poem that will be a prompt to a further discussion. In the sciences, it might be a graph, or it might be an experimental scenario that we might discuss with you. And the point is, it will be unfamiliar because we want to know what can you do with unfamiliar material. Do you have the intellectual flexibility to work with it? Do you have the curiosity to push with it? Are you willing to take on new ideas if the interviewer gives you some different suggestions? So with all of that in mind, going back to your original question, what can you best do? That's maybe the thing to practice. Talking to people about your subject, talking to your school teachers, for example, if they've got time, about any things that you haven't covered in your curriculum as yet, so that it's unfamiliar to you. So you can get practice at thinking on your feet and coming up with ideas around unfamiliar things. And getting used to having that confidence to say, I don't know, but I've got an idea, I'll try this. So getting used to talking about things you're unfamiliar about, that's probably the best practice you can be doing, whatever subject you happen to be in.
Okay, thank you for that. And a similar question is, what if you don't know the answer? How should you go about it?
Well, first off, it's okay not to know the answer to things that you're being asked in the interview. And that's because of what we're actually trying to do in that interview. Often, I interview medicine, for example. I don't actually get a huge amount out of the interview if I'm asking people about stuff that they clearly know about, because they can't demonstrate those intellectual skills to me if it's something they just know the answer to. So if I start asking about something and it's clear they already know, I'll move on to something else. And if they know about that, I'll move on to something else. And I'll keep moving till I've found something that they're finding a bit more tricky, a bit less familiar, and then we can explore that and see what your potential is. See how well you can deal with something that's unfamiliar. So it's okay to have got to a point in an interview where you don't know the answer immediately. And it's okay to say, I don't know. Can I just have a moment to think? That's perfectly fine too. But then it's important to give it a try. Don't just sit back and say, I don't know, I haven't covered this in school, and sit back and don't say anything else. Because that comes across as saying, I only am interested in knowing what my teachers have told me. And that doesn't come across as well. But if you say, I don't know, I'm going to try something, could it be this?
Mhm.
And explain why you think it might be that, that's much better. You might be completely wrong, but you'll have demonstrated that you're willing to give it a go. The interviewer can then maybe give you a bit of help and say, well, that's an interesting idea, but how about looking at it this way? Have you considered conservation of momentum? Have you considered looking at the historical context? Or whatever the subject is, there'll be a different way of looking at things. But they might give you some help. And that's again no different to the sort of small group teaching, the supervisions we do here, the tutorials they do in Oxford. Again, we're not expecting you to know everything in that small group teaching, where you'll be coming along with ideas and we'll be saying, oh, interesting idea, but what about this? And we're wanting to see in that kind of teaching that you can take on new ideas and be flexible and try out new things. And that's a microcosm of what we want to see in the interview as well. Are you flexible? Can you take on new ideas? When you present it with new information, do you give it a try? So not knowing is not a problem. Giving it a try, even when you don't know, is the most important thing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And this year, given that your interviews are online, there's the potential for students, applicants, to have their notes in front of them or to Google answers during the interview. What would you say about that?
Well, that fits into the same kind of thing. That sure, I could ask you a question about antibodies or something, and you could very quickly Google if you're fast at that kind of thing, and give me an answer. In which case, that's not actually doing you very many favors. All that shows me is you may have been told that by somebody at school already, in which case I'll move on. I'll be looking for something else, because I'm looking for the point where we can discuss an intellectual problem that you're unfamiliar with. So Googling, all that does is take up time of me then moving on to a completely different topic. It's not really going to help you in that regard. You should bear in mind that it's not about knowing stuff. Knowledge by itself isn't what we're trying to test. It's about understanding and intellectual skills rather than knowledge itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, can students bring anything to the interview in terms of preparing content to talk about, for example?
Unless you've been specifically asked to do that by your college, well, we wouldn't expect people to bring anything in a normal in-person, and so we wouldn't expect anybody to bring anything to an online one. It might be different at some colleges in some subjects. Architecture, for example, they might ask you to bring something. I don't know. I don't actually look after architecture, but for the most part, no. There are, however, a few things that you could bring to your interview that are not to do with your subject. It's worth having pen and paper nearby, for example. We're going to be, especially in the sciences, different colleges will be using different whiteboard techniques, for example, to try and share information with you, or so that you can draw information for us. But we're going to do our best with whatever technology everyone's got available. And if that doesn't quite work, then your ability just to draw something on a piece of paper and show us up at the screen, that will get across the message. Or it might be that as the interviewer is asking you a question, you just want to jot something down to remind yourself as they're talking about it, or you just want to do a quick bit of rough working out of a problem, especially in the sciences. That's all fine. Do tell us what you're doing, because that shows us your thought processes you're going through, showing us your intellectual skills. But just having a pen and paper close to hand is a sensible thing to have. Similarly, and I know it sounds kind of obvious, but just make sure you got things like your laptop charger and things like that. But what you don't want is your battery to run out halfway through an interview or something stressful like that. If something problematic does happen with the technology, your college will work with you to try and find another time or another way to do that assessment. We understand that this is a really difficult year, and of course it's the first year that we've done anything like this, online interviewing. So we know that there's bound to be the odd time when the technology fails at one end or the other, and we'll all do our best to make sure that everybody gets a proper, fair shot at it. But you can limit the chances of that by just doing simple things like making sure your laptop's fully charged and having a charger to hand and so on.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that you're looking for the best applicants. Does that include personality, as in, does that include being a nice person? Or let's say you're really smart, but you're very arrogant. Would that disadvantage you?
No, it's incredibly difficult to assess what somebody is really like. I mean, even if we were interested in their personality, which we're not, but even if we were, it's incredibly difficult to assess somebody's real personality in 20 minutes or half an hour of relatively stressful circumstances of an interview when you're 17. That doesn't tell me very much about what you're going to be like in less stressful circumstances when you're 21. So even if I did want to assess people's personalities, then the interview wouldn't really be the effective way of doing it.
Yeah.
But as it is, it's not something that bothers us. If it was something that was so extreme it got in the way of your ability to flexibly interact on an intellectual level with the problem you're being presented, then that might be an issue. But that's so incredibly unlikely. That's not, in all the time I've been interviewing, that's not something that's ever come up.
Okay.
Yeah, insisting that the interviewer is wrong all the time might not go down tremendously well, but it's still not even going to be held against you. It's about what your intellectual skills are like.
Okay, that's interesting. I just remember I heard someone saying, if you're not a nice person, they might not like you because they don't want to have to teach you for 3 years. But it's interesting to hear another opinion.
Well, yeah, of course we do. We are going to be teaching you for 3 years.
Yeah.
But as I say, what you come across as at interview and what you are actually going to be like for those 3 years are potentially completely different things. So even if that did interest us, it would be foolish to use the interviews for that purpose and a bit of a waste of our time.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that is that we're also not bothered about a sort of polished performance. Yeah, a lot of people get quite worried that they need to present themselves in a certain way. They've got to come in and sort of put on an act. But no, it doesn't bother us in the slightest. It doesn't bother us if you stumble over your words a bit. It doesn't bother us if you look nervous. Any of that. None of that's really of interest compared to how well do you think. So we're not after a polished performance. We're not after nice people. We're just after the best intellectual students with the greatest potential to do well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So personal statement, obviously, is something that everyone has to do. Some people have questions asked about it, others don't. Do you think there's a rule of thumb as to like when questions will be asked about it?
No, not really. Part of it depends on if there's a particular policy in that college. Part of it will depend from an interviewer to interviewer. And part of it will depend on the subject. There's some subjects where medicine, let's say, you'll have probably mentioned any work experience that you've had the opportunity to do within that. So you can imagine that it's more common to then follow up on that and try and probe, well, what did you learn from it? What did you think of that experience? Has it changed the way you thought about healthcare, for example? So where there's things in a personal statement that are directly relevant towards the subject that you are applying for and working out if you are the most suitable person for that subject. You know, do you really understand what's involved in being a doctor or a vet or a lawyer, for example? Then yes, elements of that personal statement become more important. One way in which a personal statement can be used is, and this is why some interviewers go for this approach, is that if it's a topic that you've mentioned that you're interested in your personal statement, then it can be quite good to see how well engaged you are with that topic. Yeah, basically take something that you're clearly interested in. What intellectual skills do you bring to bear to something you're really interested in? And we'll see how well that's gone. And then we'll move on and go to something quite opposite and go to something unfamiliar and see how the two compare. So many interviewers who do that, they're doing it in part because they want to know how, on something that you really do enjoy, how far do you take it beyond the curriculum in interest? But also, it's just a way sometimes of allowing you to talk about something you feel comfortable with and something that you enjoy first, so that hopefully any nerves you've got will relax a little bit as you go into the interview and the interview progresses. So it'll help you perform and show everything to your potential. That does mean, of course, make sure that anything that's in your personal statement you can actually talk about. We're not in. Obviously, many of the people who are watching us, they've already written their personal statements, already sent them in. Do look back at those. Remember what you said, and remember what books you said you read. Make sure you've actually read them. I mean, it's if there's one thing that can go badly wrong with a personal statement, it's admitting that this thing that you said, oh yes, it's a fantastic book on so and so, actually you've not read it. Just think what that shows us about your intellectual skills. So right now, if you haven't read one or two of those things, you've got a couple of weeks. I'd go away and read it.
It's probably not good for you to know, but I have heard of quite a few people who have received offers and got in, and they've been asked about books in their interview. Those books, they said they read in the personal statement, but they hadn't read.
Well, they are, yeah, there may have been other elements of the interview and the rest of the process that stood strongly in their favour. Got to remember that the interview is only one part of the whole process. It's only one of the bits of information we look at. It's an important bit, and obviously it's worth taking incredibly seriously, but it's only one part of the whole. You've got a lot of information to weigh up, that your academic track record, your school's reference, if you've done any pre-interview or at-interview assessments, how well you performed on those as well. So a lot of different things go into that view. And with the interviews, you'll have multiple reports. You're from all the different interviewers involved in the different interviews, all of whom might have, slightly different viewpoints on how you performed. So lots of people will have a story about how this part of an interview didn't go so well, but nonetheless they got in, or they got away with this, or so on. And probably it was noticed, but there were plenty of other great things about that application that just tipped them better than somebody else.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then a couple more practical questions. When will students hear if they have an interview?
In terms of precise dates, well, that might depend slightly college to college.
Yeah.
But just to give you a sense of the overall process we're going through at the moment, we've of course received all of the UCAS applications from 15th of October deadline, and we've processed those all through, and everybody who has been sitting a pre-interview assessment will have sat them already. There's a few people who there were either computer problems or they had to isolate or so on, so the university's looking at ways to make sure that they can have that assessment at a slightly different time. And those individuals will know what our plans are for that. But especially in those subjects where they're doing a pre-interview assessment, obviously we can't make any decision on interviews until we get the results of those assessments. And those results will start coming to us in the next week or so. And as soon as those results are coming to us, that's when we'll start making decisions. It's very important to us that we get all the information on everybody who's applying for a subject at a college before we make a decision on everybody. It's what we call looking at the gathered field, looking at everybody in that one to kind of compare against each other. So we don't kind of say, oh, well, we'll make a decision on this person and then we'll make a decision on another person, 2 weeks later. We'll get all the information on everyone and then send those decisions out all at once. We'll always aim to give at least 2 weeks notice before an interview, where at all possible. So working backwards, our aim is to make sure that you'd be hearing from us in kind of about a week's time, to between there and the end of November.
So mid to end November.
Mid to end of November. Now, those of you who have applied for medicine, you've done the BMAT, of course. Hope you did well. But the BMAT results come to us a little later than the other pre-admissions assessment results, which is why the medicine call to interviews come a little later than the others. So if you've got a friend at the same school who's also applied to Jesus just for a different subject, and they've got an email and you haven't, that's just because all the medicine ones just have to be that little bit later because we're waiting for the BMAT results.
Okay, interesting. And is there a major contributing factor which decides whether you get an interview, such as the admissions test or GCSEs or something else, or is it really holistic?
No, it's a combination of all of these things. There's no, we don't just sit there and say, yeah, basically you need to do this and you get an interview, and if you don't do this, you don't get an interview.
Yeah.
And so on. We're looking at all of those different features that I mentioned: GCSE record, personal statement, schools reference, and any pre-assessment scores, and those predicted A levels or equivalent IB scores, for example. I'm trying to say for each person, does this person have a realistic chance of making our standard offer next summer? Does this person have a reasonable chance of being potentially made an offer if they do well at interview? That's what's going through our mind with everybody. If we felt the reasons for not calling somebody to interview are if, on balance, we felt it was unlikely that they would make the level of the standard offer next summer.
Yeah.
And that can be, based on a lot of factors. We'd make that decision based on what your teachers were saying about predicted grades, as well as how you do in any test and so on. Or if we felt that on the basis of all that information, even if you did really very well at interview, it would still be unlikely that you would get an offer, given whatever else is in that file. And then we'd think, well, it'd be a bit unfair to put you through an interview in those processes. So those are the reasons for not calling people to interview. But that's why we need to go through every single person's file and decide on a person-by-person basis.
Okay, great, thank you. This is the last question I've got written down, and it's just, what do you wear?
Oh, anything you like. I mean, obviously, make it legal. But again, it's not something that bothers us. Wear what you're comfortable in. Don't feel as though you need to be formally dressed in a suit with a tie done up so tight you can barely breathe. That's simply not necessary. Don't feel like you should wear something. Some people say, oh, wear something really memorable. Like, I don't know, a penguin onesie or something. No, it really doesn't need to be. Just come along and be yourself. The more comfortable you are in your own self, the better you'll be able to show us your potential. We don't want anything to get in the way of you showing us your potential. So as you're dressed now, that'll be absolutely fine. Really not a problem.
Okay, great. I'm actually wearing pajamas underneath this, but I thought you
right,
wouldn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't tell. Or if this were an in-person interview, I might not suggest pajamas. But online, I can only see the top half anyway. Just something that you would wear to school, for example, or something that you would wear just going out and about. It doesn't need to be overly smart. Whatever makes you feel comfortable.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, well, this year, as I said before, it's been an odd year for everybody, of course. It's been hell for many people. And we are having to change enormously the approaches that we're using. But those changes we're making are all technical or logistical changes. Online interviews, where the interviews happen, and so on. Behind the scenes, though, behind all of this, our overall approach to interviewing remains the same. It's all about getting the best students to do our courses from whatever background. So focus on showing us your potential and showing us what intellectual and study skills you have. Focus on showing us that you really would be that best possible student. And we can put behind us this mad year of 2020, hopefully, and we can move on. And I hope to see many of you in October in 2021.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you very much for your time. And I think this should be very helpful for applicants.
It's a pleasure. Good luck, everyone.